Okay, so let's start. Yeah, it was a little bit audacious, as I said, to put myself on the list, but at the same time, as you can see by my title, also my title is a little bit audacious. So to redefining digital history and to try to add perhaps another definition, another idea of what digital history is to all those which are already existing. What I want to present in some way is, of course, a work in progress, something I'm thinking about a lot during my teaching, and also in the context, for instance, of the Interdisciplinary Center for Digitality and Digital Methods, where I'm also a member, and here at our share. And I also have to say at the beginning, I won't speak about AI today, and no generative AI, no LLM, etc., but rather about digitality as the foundation of AI in some way. And I want to speak about digital history, of course, and trying to understand what we do actually when we talk about digital history. And if you look a little bit into history and if you try to find out what it is, you see that this is not really a stable term, and they're really shifting categories, fluid semantics, and it's nothing everyone could say and explain what it is. And I will show you that even there are some opinions that it isn't at all in some way. And another perspective from which I'm interested in this topic is also our specific approach we are following here at HU Berlin, which consists of this triad of theory, method, and practice. So theory to understand why things are working out in which way, and the methods is how they work, and practice is really actually and finally doing it. And so in order to know what we are doing and to know how our methods could work, we need also to know how digital history or digitality as such works. So definitions are important, of course, but also theory and epistemology. Because on the one hand, yes, we want to know what we are doing actually, but we want also to understand how things work. So the framework in which we operate, and only if you understand this framework in which we operate, we can also know what we can know actually. So it's this epistemological question: what can we know, and where are the limits of our knowledge? And of course, and that's my final point to explain why I want to do this, is also that we need shared language and a shared conceptual framework as a basis for our discussions. So if we want to go on and discuss with each other and create new things in the field of digital history, we have to have in some way a common language. But there's still another question, a second question of some kind, because if we try to define what digital history is, and if we want to understand its implications, perhaps there's also the question whether what is the role of digital history in history as a field as such. So, and sometimes there's said there's a paradigm shift or there's not a paradigm shift. So just looking at the question of a paradigm following Thomas Kuhn, which of course doesn't really apply to humanities, as Kuhn said himself, but he nevertheless described what a paradigm shift is, and there are some elements we can also apply in the humanities. So a paradigm shift means that you have concepts, methods, standards in the field, and you're working within this concept, standards, and methods. And then there are some anomalies coming up. So there are findings which aren't really in line with what you have done so far. And then there's a crisis because you can't really explain them. And then you find a new framework, and you have a new paradigm, and all this go on from a new, and so there's a certain way of a circle. And what I want to ask as well in this presentation is whether digital history constitutes also some kind of a paradigm shift for the field of history or not. So I have two questions I want to answer. One is how can digital history be defined through theory? And the second one is whether digital history is yet another method, or whether is, as I said, a kind of a paradigm shift. What you're gonna hear in the next couple of minutes or 45 minutes, we will see. Is first how the field has been defined so far, and from this a little history of digital history, because it's always important to understand from what has been done so far to understand where we are. And then I go a little bit deeper in this ominous thing in my title, the Allographic as a theory of the digital, to try and then after that to spell out the consequences on retro-digitised sources, on born digital sources, and history as such. And I hope to demonstrate that theory also in digital history may matter and may be helpful, and that digital history in the end is on one hand a methodological option, but also a foundational necessity and even perhaps an epistemic urgency. You see, not a small program, so I just start. And let's look at the definitions or how digital history has been defined so far. The first look nowadays would, of course, bring us to Wikipedia. And I have to say, I didn't look it up, but I think it hasn't been changed since quite a while, at least 10 years or something, I suppose. But as you can read, digital history is the use of digital media and further historical analysis, presentation, and research. It is a branch of the digital humanities and an extension of quantitative history, cliometrics, and computing. Digital history is commonly known as digital public history, etc., etc., etc. So I think it's just to say it from the start, this definition on Wikipedia is not really helpful. It has with this digital public history in certain American perspective. On the other hand, you have this quantitative thing, but it's not really, you see, it's very contradictory in some way. So let's go a little bit back and in history and see how, for instance, in the Journal of American History in 2008, digital history has been defined. Just to remind you, we are 2008, so it's almost 20 years ago. And there was a digital interchange in some way in the journal, so where they asked some questions to a couple of people, and there was kind of rather like a digital interview. And they started by saying or defining digital history. As you can see, we might define digital history as anything. So research method, journal article, monograph, blog, classroom exercise that uses digital technology in creating, enhancing, or distributing historical research and scholarship. So it's a really broad definition of some, or one could say, anything that goes with digital technologies in the field of history. And this was also a question whether the contributors have different opinions on how they would define it. And one which has become quite influential is the one of William G. Thomas III. Here is a step toward a working definition. Digital history is an approach to examining and representing the past that works with the new communication technologies of the computer, the internet network, and software systems. On one level, digital history is an open arena of scholarly production communication, encompassing development of new courses, etc. And on the other hand, its methodological approach framed by the hypertextual power of these technologies to make, define, create, annotate associations in the human record of the past. And so it's rather, then it goes on, also rather defining it also in line with what William G. Thomas has done with digital public history. William Turkle, on the other hand, and Thomas also defined it in some way by the practices of what has been done. Turkle, on the other hand, has a different definition. Digital history makes use of sources in digital form. And then he defines digital sources or sources in digital form that they can be created and altered with relatively little effort or expense, that it can be duplicated easily and very easily shared and transmitted in the speed of light, and can be stored in very small volumes, and can serve as inputs in any process that can be specified algorithmically, etc. So he rather defines it from the material the field works with. And then you have also Daniel J. Cohen, who says that at least for research, digital history can be defined as the theory and practice of bringing technology to bear on the abundance we now confront. So this is then rather in circumstantial descriptions, because you have so many sources, you have so many websites, etc. And I don't know what your feeling is, but perhaps all those definitions nevertheless scratch into some way at the surface. Another approach to define digital history comes from Malte Rehbein from 2018 in his really interesting and recommendable article L'histoire de demain sera programmateur ou il ne sera pas. So this famous quote by Leroy-Ladurie. And he defines digital history first as nothing more than the application and development of new computer-based methods for the historical sciences. And what's important is, I think, is the new, because he sees digital history rather as a field, like you can see there, as a dual function, as a science of transfer, so transferring developing methods, testing them, and then transferring them to the field. And at the same time, by transferring these methods to the field, it's also a transformative science, since it transforms also the field of history, and then these new methods become normal, and then digital history goes to the next new methods and new technologies and incorporates them as well. So it's rather kind of a turnover and always being at the wake or at the front of the technological development, and bring it to the, perhaps also translating it to the field of history. And just 2, 3 more definitions, but just to show you how it has been defined so far. You have Hannu Salmi in his book, What is Digital History? Then he defines digital history as an approach to examining and representing. So examining and representing the past. It uses new communication technologies and media applications and experiments with computational methods, etc. But you see here as well, again, this new communication technologies. So in certain ways, since 15 years, it's always the new communication technologies and that are applied in this field. Okay, so a little bit different is the definition by Döring, Haas, König, and Wettlauf, and their introductions to this very digital history, so concepts, methods, and critique of digital history. And they defined it, or described it rather, as a process of discovery, which isn't yet complete. And that is a new and broad field of research, practices, and methods that has emerged and with open edges, and that a field that through technological innovation alone remains and will remain in the flux. So also as a fluid field, always incorporating new methods, but perhaps also important for the definition there is the digital history is today, as much as the digital humanities, a community of practice that is coming together. So not trying to pin it down, but rather defining it by the people doing it and by practices and by the use of new technologies. And the very last definition or non-definition I want to present you is the one by Adam Crimble in his book on technology and the historian, where he tries to follow the way how technology and historians have come together and how they found each other in some way. And for him, He means that he says that digital history means so many things that in the end it means everything and finally nothing. So that's not really possible to define it because everyone is doing his kind of digital history, and actually most of them are doing history, if I may resume a little bit his argument. And and he says also, if technology is to be central to the way historical studies remembers its evolution, then it cannot be centralized, but must instead be diffuse. And we must bring to an end our notion of the current digital history subfield. And the best way to do so that is to revise how we use the term digital history, and that it may be used perhaps just to describe a group of people, but not what they do. So if we look at the different definitions so far, and I hope for our students it's not so taking some illusions or something, it's not really a clear definition which is coming from all those different papers and exercises. However, we have enumerating technologies and also reminding of new technologies and incorporating new technologies. It's described as a specific use and practice, which brings also people together, and sometimes also a specific field of application. So whether it's digital research, digital teaching, digital communication, digital public history, or also digital history auxiliary sciences if it comes to methods. And as you could see in the end, also is a kind of refusal, so abandoning definitions altogether, and that digital history does not need definition, it needs histories. Okay, so you have 4 strategies, but if you look at them, and this is at least my impression, it's always looking at digital history from the outside, so looking what kind of technologies has been used, the way it has been using things, on what fields they have been used in some way. But there's not really a definition so far as I've seen, which is really coming from within, from asking what is the digital itself. But before we go deeper to this, to the question, what is the digital or what is digitality, I now just want to give a little tour, a history tour on digital history really fast. But I think this explains some of the things that have been said and also gives the background for a definition. If you look at the beginnings, of course, we have first historical material treated by Pader-Buser, and one could nevertheless go, if it comes to formalization, etc., even further on. But just to say that in the 1960s, we had first publications calling for the use of computers, in this case, for historical studies in the US and Germany, and very early on also in the USSR. In the 1970s, then we have mainframe computers, which have been used for quantitative methods, so economy and economic history, social history, but also for cultural studies and cultural history. For instance, for prosopographical projects, so for instance, listing all the monks in manuscripts in the 9th century, and so filtering them, ordering them, etc. So really doing cultural history in some way by using computers, in this case, large, big mainframe computers. And if you look then in the 80s, we have the arrival of the home computer or personal computer, and you find this field changing also because you have then more already elaborated software, like TootStep from Tübingen, or Clio from Manfred Thaler, whose name I have also seen in our participants list. And but there are also packages like SPSS for statistics. So they're ready-to-use tools or ready-to-use software already that has been prepared to be used also for historical research. And then everything changes in the 1990s with the internet. And then, with this, everyone is starting rather to collecting links. And everything, if it comes about using computers and in field of history, it's about collecting links and which websites to use. And then you have new forms of scholarly communication, like HNet and later on Hazard's Cult, but also new form of historiography and digital public history, using this new technology, communication technology, also to present and to involve people in the field of history. And in the 2000s, then all these digitization programs are starting. And just like Gallica or Old Bailey Online, Google Books, Europeana. Then again, you have a shift with social media. And in the 2010s, everyone is rather speaking about social media and the blogosphere. And like Mareike König, who has done a lot to popularize and really make public and make usable this kind of scientific blogging and as a new form of communication between scholars. And the same with the Twitter historians and Twitter. And with the 2020s, we see the arrival of, also in the field of history then, of machine learning and generative AI. So what I wanted to show you is that with each decade, more or less, or with each new technology, also the field of history or digital history, or what we could describe as digital history, changed at least its topics and what it's been doing. So you had first numerical, non-numerical computers to treat historical questions. But then with the internet, you have public history and digital scholarly communication, which are becoming more important. But then in the 2010s, besides all the social media things, you have then the digital humanities, which again bring methods and computational methods in the field. And this part here, so from the 2000, from the internet, nevertheless is happening in a different environment, because then you have also this digitalization of society, and it's then also the environment in which historians are doing history, which is changing, and not only the application of digital methods of computers. So if you ask what is digital history, you have many, many things like digital scholarly communication, application of digital methods, digital editions, digital public history, etc. And mainly, as I said, the focus was rather on what is it doing to this specific field. But we can't also invert it and ask what is actually the digital, which is doing things to those fields. So, and in this way, the digital is in some way perhaps some kind of the core concept of digital history, which is perhaps not surprising, but nevertheless something worth to look at a little bit deeper. So, what is digital, or the digitality in some way as a converging point of digital history? And so what I want to do, and I think it's clear now, is to change the perspective, not to look what is the digital doing to history or the different fields, but to reverse this question and to ask what is actually digitality, digital, or the condition of digitality that underlies all those concepts and other things. And I think it's also important to underline that what is meant by this is not, it could be easily understood or misunderstood as the technical basis for what we are doing. So just how it works, and it's not really important, because it's really important how we apply it. But I think it's not just a technical basis, but it's the theoretical framework. And also which defines how on an epistemological level we can apply it. So what, not only to understand how it works, but also what we can do with it. For this, we need to understand what underlying structures, what underlying system is there for what we are calling digital history. So let's start by the foundation that which is digital representation of information. And you have all this analog media like text or books, images, sounds, videos, etc., which can be by different methods represented then as data, or to be really specific, because data it may have been already, but perhaps not discrete data and not distinct data, but it can be represented as finally as a binary code. So far so good. I think everyone agrees and would say, yeah, so what? And so this binary code in the end means that information is represented as in discrete symbols, which are in themselves meaningless, and they acquire meaning only through defined rules of interpretation. Now it gets a little bit more complicated. So all the zeros and ones don't really mean something, but there is a system which attributes them some meaning if they have a certain sequence, etc. And that's done by rule sets and rules of interpretation during the encoding or decoding. But information, nevertheless, is put down in just a sequence of zeros and ones. So to go a little bit deeper, what does it mean? So if, for instance, you have the sequence of 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, depending on the context and on the symbolic system or on the code and the encoding, this sequence, which has been saved or stored on some kind of carrier, may, depending on the context, mean very different things. I mean, it can mean this minuscule a, like in UTF-8, or the number of 97 if you transfer it in the decimal chiffres or numbers. But if you, for instance, have an image, it could also mean a gray value, which is going from 0 to 2255. Or it could be an octet in an IP address, or if you have MIDI, it could be C#7, so very high pitch. So depending on the context and on the coding, this sequence can get some meaning in a specific context. Just to give you examples, if you have this text, do we need a theory of the digital for digital history? It could be then represented in UTF-8, which in the end is just this binary code like this. And if you have this sneaker, you can translate it in also as an raster graphical representation of an image, and with a depth of, I think, 1 byte. So 256 different shades of gray. And then you have also your image there as a sequence of zeros and ones. So why is this important? One thing is, I'll just all of it. On the one hand, you have here this data layer. So here you have the zeros and ones. And out of the zeros and ones, you can simulate, for instance, this analog source in a DFG viewer. So to have this image simulated on your screen, or different ways to represent those informations. But also in all the zeros and ones, there are many other information encoded there, which then by using different methods like text analysis or computer vision or network analysis, then you can bring together and also present in a different way. The important thing here is that you have on the one hand a data layer where the information is stored, and on the other hand, the presentation layer, this is what you then can see. And now I still want to dive even a little bit deeper. With this concept of allographic by Nelson Goodman, he wrote in '68 a book, Languages of Art, where he tried to understand as an analytical aesthetics, so a totally different field. But he wanted to understand what actually a work of art is. and not just by its emotional experience, but really to understand it as a cognitive symbol system. And he found out that if you want to describe the identity of a work, so when is a work a specific work, that you have two different ways to constitute this kind of work. So one is through the object and its history, where it's combined to, and the other is through the structure and its notation or notation. And he describes the one as an allographic work, which is bound in unique or original. So the identity of this kind of work depends on the history of production, of its production, and also on the specific support on which it is applied to. And that's why this kind of autographic work, which like could be a painting, for instance, or a manuscript, can be forged. And just to, I didn't put an image there because I don't know what I have here, but so just this could be a kind of work or some autographic work. And already if I would take a picture and put it there in my presentation, this would be forgery, or it wouldn't be at least this work anymore. Nevertheless, there's another kind of work, and this is the allographic work, and that's what interesting for us in this context. And this is defined by the sameness of spelling in a notation. So independently of the production of history, it's not something, the kind in which something is written down, so the material object, but the notation. So like a music score, for instance, or a literary text. You can copy the same literary text and it still remains the same text. But each copy, of course, is a different autographic work. So what makes a work allographic? And this is the notation, so a system of characters that is systematically, syntactically disjoint and finally differentiated. So it's discrete and distinct. So you have a set of unambiguous symbols, like, for instance, notation system for music scores or different alphabets. And with them, you can produce work of arts, which is just a sequence of this signs, for instance. And where such a notation governs the identity, so any correctly spelled instance of this work is this work, and there's no original in some way, because what's important is just this notation. And how is this important for us as historians for digital history? For instance, in the analog world, if you have an analog transmission, you have, for instance, some text, which would be allographic, since it's a text, it's put down or put together by different characters. But in order to bring it forward and for the transmission of it, it has to be reinscribed again and again in an autographic object. So always in a unique object, and this unique object in some way is the witness of the transmission of this specific text. So this specific allographic work. So each time when it's handed down, and if you have a new copy, you have also a new instance in some way of its history and transmission. While autographic works, by contrast, of course, cannot be copied as such, but each one is a specific unique object. So I have specific unique objects, which then can bring on and hand down allographic works. If you go then to the digital representation and you try to understand how it works in the digital, then all this relation is reversed. Then the autographic becomes allographic. Where if you have already a notational system like text or music or mathematics, for instance, then you can re-encode it on a second level. And as you have seen with the text before, which then you can represent still in an allographic, in a new allographic way, which would be this binary code. On the other hand, if you have genuinely autographic sources like a single picture, a manuscript, or a sound recording, if you look at the digital representations, you have a way also to express this kind of source of work as in an allographic way. So by measuring or representing sampling of the sound, so to separate by time and every other millisecond to take the frequency and then represent it in a distinct value. Or as you have seen for this image of the sneakers, the pixels and the values of on this grayscale in a given set of numbers. And by this, then you also have in the end, an allographic representation, which is nothing else than just an code to represent this allographic representation of this autographic work. So in the end, either it's text or music, score or mathematic symbols, or whether it's pictures or of a manuscript page or sound recordings, everything is then represented in a binary code, which is in the end a perfect notational system and can be used as this, so as an allographic system. And to go on a little bit about the materiality and authenticity of this kind of representation. If you look at how this code, this sequences of zeros and ones, so this binary code is stored, it's always stored nevertheless in an analog way. So you have it as a physical thing like light signals, voltage pits on the CD, or a magnetic charge. There's always physical, so it's always analog. But then you have the system which is reading them, and this is the concept by Hoagland. And the system, so the machine, so to speak, decides whether it's a 0 or 1. And only then, by reading it, or also then by writing it, the system disaggregates them and represents this information in a digital way. So, and then what you have there encoded in physically becomes a digital code, but there's nothing you can touch or you can see in some way, only if you look at you don't get really to understand what all these zeros and ones mean. And then to get an output, you have to transform it again into an analog representation. Like you can see me now on the screen in an analog way, but the transmission between me and you is in a digital way as different states of zeros and ones. And the important thing is each of you see me differently, because each one has perhaps also little different infrastructure, has different devices, has a different kind of personalization of this all. And and the output is always a one-time instantiation, allographic instantiation of what's encoded in this allographic way. But the most important part of this is that if it comes to the identity of the information stored here or here, this matter, this physical thing is not related to the identity. So you can transfer it to different kinds, so into light or voltage, etc. It is still the same sequence of zeros and ones. And even if you want to alter it, like for instance, if you would strike out something here, this would be leave a trace on this identical, on this specific support, on substrate of this information, but it's not what's happening in the digital, because you have there the identity of the thing which is represented decoupled from this matter or above the object which is holding it. And this is important because then the materiality no longer proves authenticity, because all information is in the zeros and ones, and you can always store it physically, but in different ways. So, and perhaps the last thing, or almost last thing, I think, for the question of digitality is that is this rule-governed rewriting of notation? What does it mean? It just means computation. Because once you have any information represented in this discrete and distinct manner in a symbol system, you can also compute it. So you can rearrange or using certain rules to rearrange those symbols. So they can be overwritten or can be filtered, sorted, etc. And that's what just computation is, to rewrite symbols according to given rules, like in the Turing machine. And this means also you can scale up this kind of algorithmic processes because they are always right. And you have also this idea of universality, so like the universal Turing machine, that this machine is not there for a specific kind of symbols, but you can, as you have seen also with the 0 and 1s representing letters or pitches, etc., you can treat any kind of symbol system by this machine. So what digital means here is that with this allographic digital object means that you can copy it without loss, you can transmit it ever identical notation, because it's always a notation which describes the information which it holds. You can alter it without leaving trace, at least on the carrier. And you can combine it, link it, and compute it. And the important thing is, nevertheless, that it's not detached from materiality, because it's always bound to an infrastructure, and you always need a physical machine and you need software to interact with the information, because it always has to be reenacted and instantiated in an analog way, because otherwise, at least so far, you couldn't interact with it. And the other point is that it's always beneath the level of semantics. So it's always, and it's also what, for instance, Shannon has used or shown, that you can separate the information from its content this way, because the information is just a structure, and it's not important which information it holds semantically. You can just quantify it. So it means that you can put in the system any kind of information, and you still have to interpret it. And what the system does is just to treat the symbols in different ways. Okay, and what are the consequences of this then for historical research and for digital history? So if you understand digitality this way, as this kind of allographic representation, and differentiate it from this orthographical differentiation. And the first thing is that on the first step, I would like to look at the retro-digitized material. So, for instance, if you have a unique exemplar of a book, and the emphasis of unique exemplar, so it's just really one specific book and not a text. So it's an orthographic representation of a work of art. And if you then scan it, for instance, then you're already in this allographic domain. So it's already a series of zeros and ones, which always can recreate the same information. And you can then bring into OCR or fill in a database, whatever. So you can always then put on new perspectives on it. But the important thing is then you have this this unique material thing, and you bring it into a digital representation. And of course, what you will say is the first thing, yeah, okay, and this, if you do this, you are modeling. The important thing is to model it, and then because it's not just the machine is not neutral, and for instance, the scanner, but you have to define what kind of information you will take, which kind of, for instance, light has been reflected by this book, and on which, so you have to select certain features and the level of abstraction. And always, if you model, you have always a purpose or goal. So there's really a certain set only of information holding by this object, by this material object. This is a continuity of granularity, so you can have endless ways to represent it and to have information there, and you have to select some and to have describe or decide on a level of abstraction and for a purpose. And you can do it, for instance, on like here you have this landscape painter, and like he is sitting there and deciding, okay, I will paint this church and this river and those trees, but I don't take this little grass here or the stones. In the same way, you decide which kind of animation you take, in which way, whether you have an aquarelle or if you have an like you have it here. Or you can just describe it in a textual form. But it's not yet the digital way in some way. It becomes really digital and allographic if you bring it in a symbol system, and the symbol system means that you have to formalize it. Like for this representation here, if you then put on a scheme of 80 to 54 cells, and each time you take the gray value of the gray and you put it on a range on 0 to 256, then you have a discrete and distinct representation of this image. And the same, for instance, if you describe it by keywords and you use, for instance, eigenclass, then you have unique identifiers to refer to specific concepts. And with this, then you can go on and you can do a research. And based on the formulation, we can then analyze those information that we have taken, that we have decided to represent in our digital representation, and analyze it and then get new insights in the things. So digitalization, computation. So this modeling and formalization just turn selected aspects of our material source into a code. So text structure, images, metadata, etc. And then we can use it and for our research. And as you can see here, we can extract information, enrich it, analyze it, explore it, and use the results ever again as new data. But if we look also at our question whether this is a paradigm shift, I think it's clear it's not. It's just another option we have to deal with our sources and do historical research. Okay, so, and if we want to give it a name, perhaps we could also call it computational history, because here we compute historical data. This may shift, I think, if we come now to digital-born sources. So if you ask what kind of sources do we have if we do this history of the 21st century, of course we have all kinds of public communication, so all this social media things, private communication, websites, as you can see here, with very different multimodal modal information, very difficult to keep. Data publications or software is also kind of sources, but you have also governmental records, you have memes, you have media outlets, very meaningful social media posts, but also chats or video postcards, videos and podcasts, etc. So this is quite a different kind of sources than we usually have if we try to categorize it this way. So the question would be, how do we deal with these new kind of sources? How we can do a history of the 21st century? And what we can observe if it comes to born digital sources and source criticism, and then we look back to Kuhn, that there are anomalies, and which has been quite seen. So the old source categories do not longer work really, and there are no new ones yet. but also that, for instance, this question of authenticity is put to question. In the Historic Attack 2023, there was a discussion about the end of the original, but also question of authorship. That's not easy to define who is the author of a PDF file, for instance, or of a social media post, or also question of preservation. How can we preserve at all this kind of sources, or what we call born digital sources? So the discipline or in history registers all these anomalies, but this nevertheless discuss it in all vocabularies, or what you could also call this update strategy. So you have this idea that you have this common source criticism, and you just need some updates to the source criticism as we know it, like data critique, metadata critique, etc. So and if you look then at source criticism, you have this outer criticism and this inner criticism. And I think it's clear that this outer criticism doesn't really work. But nevertheless, if you look at the discussion, you could get the impression, nevertheless, in certain ways that there's still this idea that the source is a singular material object, and that you can compensate for this loss of authenticity, or that you can't really do this auto-criticism by technical things like taking metadata, protocols, and capture logs, etc. So this way to deal with source criticism and for born digital sources still holds in some way this idea of that a born digital source is an object. Even if it's a fragile one, it's an object, and then you can do your source criticism on it. But following what I said on this theoretical part, what digital is, or digitality, you could question this concept. So, and ask, what is actually this kind of source? And just to remind you that this in this digital representation is created on a screen or by the machine itself, for instance. It is preserved and transmitted as a bit stream, and that only if it's then displayed on an individual, displayed on the screen or printed out, etc., it's always only then it's an individual autograph. Then it has some specific features. So in some way, you could also think that the source as such, as a unique object, doesn't really exist anymore for born digital sources. Because this allographic system is just representing the code how to represent something, but to become something that you can see and that you can perceive, it has to be instantiated, and then it's only then it becomes some kind of an object for you, but not this notation. And you can go even a little bit deeper and ask so if those objects are also computable and networkable. So what in the end is this born digital source? And there you could also differentiate between different kinds. You could take, for instance, a self-contained file like a PDF. There you have all the context and also metadata, etc., within the file, and which is closed. And you could also see whether there are changes, provided that you have other copies of the same file. So there you have one code, for instance, which holds all the information. This changes if you have a database, a dynamic database, where you have different views, and then it would be more difficult to reconstruct the different ways people could have looked at and combined the information. But what you have is the underlying data, perhaps. But if you have in the end something like a complicated web page, which is a network assemblage like from a web page or a social media post with elements from different systems. One system, for instance, provides the fonts like a Google font, for instance, and making trouble this way. Then the other one provides the images or embedded posts or the handles of this social media accounts. Or you have executable JavaScript in it, and you have database results, and then it's also server-side generated content. then this object isn't any object anymore, but it's not really reconstructable anymore. It's just a state which has been lived for one moment in time when someone has been looking at it and has it instantiated this way, for instance, on his screen. So the identity, so to understand whether then digital born or born digital sources are objects or not, that is, so one perspective is, or one insight would be that from this theory that identity is notational. It's not on an object, but it's just in this sequence of zeros and ones in the end. And that this uniqueness migrates. It's not the source, it's not the file, but only if the file is instantiated at a certain given moment that you have this unique representation. And for doing so, you have it's also rather a process than a thing, because you need this the system running, you need the infrastructure for the software, etc. And then if you have it also networked, then it becomes open. You have not really boundaries to the object, but it's rather some kind of state of interrelated information from different sources. And so it's not really anymore an object, but rather a structure in some way. At least as something you could conclude from this information. But what's important here for me is that this could be a kind of a paradigm shift, in the sense that we have anomalies, that we have to find new concepts to describe them. And then with these concepts, for instance, also the practices change. For instance, we don't have, or it may be that we don't have the idea that we recreate a web page, but we can only recreate certain parts and certain information of the web page, like the text, or for instance, the CSS or the images, but not the thing as such that this one can't be recreated anymore, even if this idea of the recreated digital object, it is gone. So we have perhaps to describe and define born digital sources as a new way of, a new kind of sources, which doesn't work in the same way like traditional sources. And the very last, and I'm coming to the end, a very last perspective is that one of epistemic urgency. And what I mean by this is that if those sources work differently, or this what we describe the source, or how information is represented and used differently, this doesn't just stop by the sources and source criticism methods, but it changes also what history constitutes, or what constitutes history itself. So by this different way of representing information, also history as such and our field and what we are doing and what we are studying is changing. And if you look, of course, over the last 30 years, you have fundamental changes in culture and politics, society, etc. And Felix Stalder described it very good in his book on Kultur der Digitalität, or digital competition. So the fragility, so that you have always art of work, or just a representation, or an object is referring, or you're enhancing a given object by linking, quoting, and remixing things, which is easy since you have the notation code. And then you can just change it and then to release it again and again and again. And by this, you have also communality, so that you have, instead of central institutions, little communities forming in social, especially in social media, and also algorithmicity, so that you have more and more automated procedures, since the symbolic system can be computed, and you have automation, and they describe or they define how you can access information in the end. So you have many changes also in real life, how the digital and the representation of the digital influences history, like events like Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit, or Facebook and Rohingya genocide, where Facebook played an important role, or such TikTok trends like Dubai chocolate, and they don't have pistachios anymore because everyone is following or want to have Dubai chocolate, for instance. But also cultural practices, so how you deal with images has changed fundamentally, but also foundations like, for instance, the relation between the citizen and the state and surveillance in authoritarian states, but also platform biases and political influencing, data sovereignty, platform capitalism, etc., etc. So there are so many things which are influenced by what we call digital or the condition of digitality. And we can ask ourselves what our role as historians is here. Whether we should study what's happening in the 19th century or the beginning of the digital revolution, or whether it's also our role as historians to contextualize and give some historical depth to what we are seeing now, what's happening, and give some orientation and also a critical corrective of what we are observing, and to studying it from our competencies and our skills we have as historians, especially as digital historians, which have some understanding of the process of or the conditions of digitality. So, and the question is whether we are equipped for this, and whether we have really the concept and the understanding to bring in a different voice, which gives perhaps this discussion some depth. And on the same time is also the history as such, which may, and the concept of history as such, which may change. Because if you have different concepts of space of time due to this kind of allographic representation of information, that you have, there's no really, or Noller described this as a digital virtuality, as an ontological thing. So that time and space have different meanings. And if main part of our society and our culture is happening in this digital virtual world, then we have to get to a better understanding and have to understand whether also what we describe as, or how we conceive history may change. Because also what is kept and what will be lost is working differently now. And also the influence of infrastructure and algorithms and AI make a history have a large impact. And if, and we say that we have, for instance, we have a kind of, we could distinguish between oral societies, orality, literacy, and now digitality. We know that between orality and literacy, concept of history has changed. And the question would be whether it changes also if then we differentiate between literacy, or this age of literacy, and digitality. So for instance, if we take Assmann's cultural memory and we observe this under digital conditions, so Assmann's did this differentiate between communicative memory, so the lived everyday things, which reaches 3 generations, and cultural memory, which has then been institutionalized and objectivated, so in canons, archivals, and rituals, etc., which nevertheless needs always a distance. And if this distance is lost by this virtuality, and so where the present and something 5 years ago and 20 years ago is at the same distance, and so you could also really ask whether then this idea of memory and of history may change in some way. So to come to very short conclusions. My first question was, how can digital history be defined through theory? And I think I hope I could show or demonstrate that digital history is several things. It can be an expanded methodological repertoire, like computational history, where you use computational methods to get new insights. But also you can describe it, or you can understand it as a foundational science based on this theoretical approach, which needs to develop new concepts and methods for digital or for non-digital sources and source criticism. But also it influences theory of history. And you can also understand it, or I hope to understand it also in an analytical category. So not write a history of digitality, but the history through digitality. So to take digital or digitality as a category of analysis and explanation. And if you bring it all together, you could come up with a very easy phrase like digital history is a study of history under the conditions of digitality. And if you want to go a little bit deeper, you could also ask, but if you are dealing with the question, why does it work this way and how it works? So on theory and methods, this would be included in, especially included in this question of digital history, while if you just practice this, you do just history. And the second question was, is digital history yet another method or turn, or is it a paradigm shift? You can just answer both. On the one hand, if it comes to retro-digitized sources, so material sources, but also if you have the historical information before you, it's just another method how to analyze them. But so you can also say that there's a potential paradigm shift, because at least if you look at born digital sources, they work differently, and you can't really describe it with the same terms and with the same concepts anymore. And then perhaps we need to come up with something new to understand and to better grasp and analyze and work with what we find in this age of digitality as sources, and how to, for instance, do the history of the 21st century. So I know it was quite long, but I just took advantage of the position that that I'm also one of the co-organizers. I'm sorry for that, but these are things I wanted to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.